while we're waiting, I thought I'd just say, I was having dinner with John Cleese recently.
Oh.
And I'm very proud to call a friend. And he was saying, I asked him, what are you doing? And he said, well, we're thinking of adapting the life of Brian for the stage, but there are some difficulties with this. First of all, having 3 people crucified on stage, and we thought that we'd have to find some other way of doing this. And so I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, we've rewritten it slightly. And so it goes like this. Pilate says, take him away and have him crucified. And then this henchman says, no, can't do that. He said, what do you mean can't do that? No wood. They were going to deliver on Monday. And he said, oh, well, we'll have to think of something else. Well, I suppose we could boil him in oil, tear him limb from limb. And Brian is listening to this and he leans forward, taps him on the shoulder and said, I'd just like to put in a word for crucifixion. So I hope I'm not offending anybody. Jesus, the Brian figure is let off the hook slightly because Pontius Pilate has a wife called Fiona, which is rather delightful. And Fiona has become a Christian, and she gets very cross with Pontius Pilate and says, you must go out there and make a public apology. So he goes out onto a balcony and he goes, well, basically, mistakes were made.
Well, thank you for coming. Have a great night. Thank you, Ian. We needed some comedic relief there. Well, welcome everybody to the inaugural evening of the Metaphysics and the Matter with Things conference, in which we're going to be thinking with Iain McGilchrist over the next couple of days. And let me say just straight away, Ian, it's wonderful to have you with us here in-house. It's a long journey from the Isle of Skye, which seems like the edge of the earth in some way. So we're really happy to have you. We're happy to have all of you. We have about 100 of you in-house. We have about 300 online. So thank you to all of you who are joining us from the comfort of your own homes. Let me tell you just briefly who I am. My name's Andrew Davis, and I'm the program director leading research and program directing at the Center for Process Studies. The Center for Process Studies is a nonprofit research organization focusing on education, focusing on philosophy, economics, psychology. We do a lot. We're a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary organization founded originally in 1973 by John B. Cobb Jr. and David Griffin, perhaps known to some of you. And we're founded principally on the thought of Alfred North Whitehead, not exclusively, but we're fans of Whitehead. We like to think with Whitehead. And we exist to further scholarly connections, education in relational and holistic worldviews. So you can begin to see why Ian's work becomes attractive to us. And I want to just give a few thanks quickly because Matt Siegel, where's Matt?
Oh, yeah.
There you are, Matt. Stand for us for a second. Let's give Matt a hand. Organizational efforts, your leadership, and to the CIS staff and volunteers. Thank you. You guys are making this space possible. I also want to have Jared Morningstar stand.
Yeah.
We've all received emails and messages and endless communication. So Jared, thank you for making this possible for us. Let me just give a sense of the narrative backdrop of how this event emerged, and I'll try to be brief. It was Christmas morning of 2021. Lo and behold, under the Christmas tree was a large, heavy, biblical in scope text. It was the only thing I asked for that holiday, and my family responded. So it was, of course, Ian's book, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. I started reading it over the next couple of weeks. And as program director for CPS, Center for Process Studies, I have an antenna. I try to keep my antenna going for works, projects, thought leaders that we can focus on. And it became very clear to me that this book merited an event of its own, a conference of its own. In fact, Iain told me earlier that this is the first formal conference he's had on his thought. And I do think his thought merits that, certainly. So I sat on the idea of an event for on Iain's book for a couple of days. And with most ideas that I think are good, I bring them to Matt Siegel first to get his idea. So I emailed Matt, found out that Matt had already met Iain actually before they had a meal together. And I ran the idea by him. Would CIIS be interested in co-sponsoring an event which would wrestle in a collegial manner with Iain's work? And there's two reasons for doing so. Not only, I would say, because he's developed what I would say, Iain, is a daring and rather adventurous process relational Weltanschauung, which CPS is interested in. But he's done so in a truly interdisciplinary manner. Neuroscience and psychology, for example, physics and biology, philosophy and aesthetics, spirituality and the sacred. So if you've looked at the schedule, you'll see that I've just named where we're headed in the next couple of days. So it's going to be an adventurous time. And as we get started, Matt, I'm going to invite you up to offer a few words of context, maybe some housekeeping, and then Matt will introduce Dr. Iain McGilchrist. But thank you, everyone, for being here. We look forward to all that we're going to learn from each other.
Andrew, thank you so much for this idea, for your collaboration, for your work, which we'll hear more about on Sunday. Welcome to CIIS. I'm Matt Siegel. I'm an associate professor here in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. I'm curious how many of you are here at CS for the first time? Okay. How many of you are from outside of California? Anyone from overseas?
Most.
Okay, and Iain. Okay, well, welcome. You've come a long way, and we really appreciate it. This, as Andrew has said, has been a few years in the making. A lot goes on behind the scenes, but it's been remarkably serendipitous. So, something is the matter. And we've gathered this weekend to attempt to address it. It happens to be Good Friday. Iain humorously reminded us of that. But you know, for many, it's a day of mourning, of crucifixion, but also of great and transformative sacrifice. And it's not an inappropriate context for our conference. Our world is suffering. Nations are at war, with more threatening to join the fray. Earth itself is convulsing. A mass extinction of species is well underway, the sixth great mass extinction in Earth's history. Human civilization is teetering on the edge. You might say on one side there are transhuman delusions, and on the other side reactionary tribalisms, and so many more issues that we are facing. We're losing our way. We're threatened by other lies, nationalism, materialism. The list goes on. But who are we? Who are we? This is a quote that Iain begins his book with from Plotinus, the Enneads. We probably know more about ourselves. We know no more about ourselves today than in Plotinus's time, thousands of years ago. Why is that? Whatever we are, we're more than Americans or Brits, or more than a gender or a race. We're more than a pack of neurons hallucinating its way through a make-believe world. As Iain himself has made very clear, while his books are about the brain permits consciousness, does not create consciousness. The brain is a portal and not a producer. We are more than our brains. And so it is not just a matter of becoming more right-brained. but of becoming more human. So we've assembled an all-star team of neuroscientists and psychologists, of physicists and biologists, philosophers, artists, theologians. This is an all hands on deck situation. And Iain's work demands this kind of inter or even transdisciplinary engagement. Our conference speakers will attempt to look through the lenses that Iain has fashioned, and they'll also be looking through lenses of their own crafting in an attempt to perceive some ways forward. We may not have an easy answer as to why there is something rather than nothing, but we do know that our existence matters. We all feel it, even if we can't yet or may never be able to fully articulate why it matters. But the fact that we feel something is the matter already signals that some ideal alternative is possible. And this alternative is beckoning to us from beyond what's given. So we know this matters. We also know for certain, and it's perhaps the only thing we know for certain, that none of us is making out of this alive. That none of us is going to make it out of this life alive. And yet we make meaning anyway. We must. All of you are here, I assume, because you've been influenced by Iain's work and because you're striving for what William James called something more. And I'm grateful to each of you for joining this effort. This is a collaborative conversational conference. We will have ample time for your contributions this weekend and from your contributions online as well. We may even have a little fun along the way. So with all that said, let me now introduce the man of the hour, the man of the weekend, Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Iain is a former fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. He is a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He is a consultant emeritus of the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital in London. He's a former research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins University Medical School in Baltimore. He's a former fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. He's also the author of the best-selling book, The Master and His Emissary, as well as more recently, The Matter with Things. I'm also lucky enough to count Iain as my friend. He's offering us a diagnosis. All civilizations rise and fall, but this time may be different. The wave of progress has grown higher and more massive, making our world more interconnected and more fragile than ever before. And we still have a chance. I know Iain well enough to know he's actually optimistic. The diagnosis that Iain has made suggests that the evil we face is not out there, it's not those other people, it's in ourselves. We must remember who we are. Iain, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt, and everyone else here at the CIIS for conceiving this and putting in a great deal of work to bring it about. And I'm genuinely touched that this should be the first occasion on which there has been a conference about my work. I'm a little uncertain whether I'm going to make any significant contribution to it, because we've got people from very many backgrounds, as Matt was saying, and this is as it should be. Because if the thesis of The Matter with Things is correct, it should apply to all of us all the time. Because I am asking the question, what is the matter with things? And my answer to that is that we don't any longer understand what a human life is, what the world is, what the cosmos is, and how we relate to it. So I'm hoping that I can explain to you why this has something to do with the brain hemispheres. This was a topic which I was very much discouraged from pursuing by those who had my best interests at heart, because of course it is known to everybody that there's nothing in this topic of hemisphere difference, because they heard it on an Instagram tweet that actually this is all pop psychology. And unfortunately, this meme, this idea is very widely spread, and it has a basis. In other words, virtually everything that you thought you knew about hemisphere differences should be set aside, because almost all of it, 95% of it, was completely wrong. And the first hurdle I have to get over, and you may have experienced this in talking to other people about why they might enjoy my work, is, oh, all that about hemispheres, that's all old hat, and anyway, we now know there's nothing in it. So I have a sort of perverse streak in me. I started off with the idea as a teenager that I was going to study philosophy and theology and almost certainly go into a monastery. In fact, it was a very good thing for me and for the monasteries that this didn't happen. But although I still think that such a life is a wonderful a gift and something very important to revere. But I then studied literature. In the middle of doing that, I realized there was a philosophical problem about the mind-body relationship that I needed to address. And I thought that the philosophers were too disembodied and that I ought to address it actually in a more embodied way by studying medicine. Part of that was due to, he's no longer around for me to kick, but Oliver Sacks, who was a great inspiration to me. And I thought this is a wonderful way to understand the relationship between somebody's embodied being and how they see the world, how they are in the world. And so, to cut a long story short, I trained in medicine, and I went to the Maudsley Hospital in London, as you heard, and there I heard somebody talk about hemisphere differences, a man called John Cutting, who had spent 25 years at the bedsides of people who had right hemisphere injuries, tumors, or strokes, and had realized that something very important happened to their world. They didn't dramatically usually lose speech. They had a paralysis, if at all, on the left side, which was apparently not important. And so people had largely neglected to look at what had happened. They seemed okay, roughly, and were sent home. But actually what happened was a catastrophe. They became out of touch with the world. They failed to be able any longer to understand the world, to put it together, to understand what other people are doing, what they mean when they say certain things. They were baffled by everyday occurrences. They took statements that were either ironic or humorous or sarcastic, literally, and they became very concerned with controlling things, and they felt very out of control. So this was something that was a revelation. But more than that, I heard him talk about how the right hemisphere alone understands implicit meaning. Now look, as far as I'm concerned, most of everything that really matters in life is implicit. Religion is a very difficult thing to put explicitly in words and expect. I know there are traditions that think this is very important, and I'm not disrespecting them, but I think that the real depth of what is meant by a sense of the divine and the sacred is something that defies ordinary speech, which is why it is best exemplified in poetry, in music, in rituals, in narratives, in myths, all of which need to remain like jokes, implicit, because once they're made explicit, they lose all their power. So that was important. Another thing I heard him say was that the right hemisphere alone understands the unique case. And I realized that one of the problems with our analytic way of looking at things is that we take elements in our experience, organic beings, maybe living beings, but also organic beings such as our works of art, as Aristotle had already said a few thousand years ago. They encountered them and made them into something general and disembodied and decontextualized. And it was this turning of the individual embodied contextual being into something abstract, devoid of context, and therefore meaning something completely different from what it meant when it was living in that context, and somehow remote from our emotional and physical being. This seemed to be plaguing us. And again, I heard this was a difference between the right hemisphere, which is more connected with the body, understands that things have to be understood in a context, and the left hemisphere, which takes them out of the context, abstracts them, and puts them in a category of general things that look rather like. And the third thing was about connection to the body itself. The right hemisphere has the body image in it, which is not just a visual image, but an image in all modalities, and is more profusely connected with the limbic system and with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, which is the thing that masters our so-called autonomic nervous responses. So that was all very interesting. And I thought, this is exciting. And I went up to the lecture afterwards and said, I wrote a book that has something in common with this, called Against Criticism, which I'd written in my 20s, which was about what was wrong with literary criticism. We took something that was a living being, that worked on us in an embodied way, that was entirely unique if it was a good work of art, and turned it into something banal and general and explicit and decontextualized, and thus destroyed it. And he said, I'd like to read that, and he did. And the result was a generous collaboration by him with me on some work, and he made available to me a lot of data that he gathered painstakingly. And together we came to some ideas that I thought were important. And I went off to Baltimore, to Johns Hopkins, into the neuroimaging department to take part in some studies on asymmetry in the brain, its important role, and the fact that it is lost or reversed very often in schizophrenia. And people with schizophrenia show deficits in just the areas that normally have an asymmetry, which is palpable in the normal brain, but it has been either reversed or lost. And so it made a great deal of sense to me. While I was there, I received a postcard from John Cutting saying, you have to read this book. And what was this book? It was a book by Louis Sass, a distinguished professor of psychology at Rutgers. That's not just my opinion, that's his title. And it was called Madness and Modernism. And I do recommend it to you. The subtitle was Insanity in the Light of Modern Literature, Art, and Thought. And it was a subtle thesis, beautifully explained in the most lucid prose, accessible to anybody who's not a specialist, showing the parallels, about 25 of them, between the phenomena exhibited by people with schizophrenia and many of the aspects that were promoted or lauded or found exceptional in the art of the last 100 years, which is not to dismiss that art in any sense, but it's a curious observation that won't go away once you've seen it. And I thought, well, this doesn't mean we've all suddenly got schizophrenia, quite clearly, and we know that, that isn't the case. There hasn't been a massive explosion of schizophrenia, but what there has been is a tendency to ignore whatever it is, the phenomenology of the right hemisphere. And I happen to know that schizophrenia mimics a situation in which there is an overdrive, a compensatory overdrive of the left hemisphere to make good deficits in function in the right hemisphere. So why was it worth enduring 30 years of obloquy to research this? I think, first of all, that science is important, and I think that it follows fashions too much. I'm a great believer in science, a great defender of science, and nowadays I have to defend it against its many critics who don't like some of its findings. My view is you can like it or lump it, but if it's science, you need to take it into account. So I think from a scientific perspective alone, it's important to understand what has hitherto been deemed to be a mystery about the structure and function of the brain, this divided nature. Though it's one, I might add, that has been partly intuited in the wisdom of traditions from diverse cultures around the world. So you find fascinating myths and stories about two principles. There's always an inequality. It's usually the master, the emperor, whatever it is, and his general or his head of services, whatever it is, the chief bureaucrat, his right-hand man, who thinks he knows too much. He just, because he doesn't know very much, he thinks he knows everything. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it works in the opposite way. The more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. There's not enough of this evident in the world around us at the moment. I think a little more humility would be probably a rather good thing. But in any case, there it is. And of course, understanding these differences in the brain might lead to new ways of conceiving and treating brain dysfunctions, mental illnesses. But much further, if the brain has any relationship to the structure of the human mind, hemisphere differences have philosophical implications, since each hemisphere is on its own capable of sustaining consciousness and of therefore bringing into being its own phenomenologically distinct take on the world. I might just say briefly that my belief, which I don't have time to expand on here, but those of you who read me will know why it is I say it, that I believe that the relationship between the brain and consciousness is not that of the generator of consciousness. I take it that there are only three logically possible relationships. One is that the brain emits consciousness. That's the one held by mainstream science. It transmits consciousness in the way that a radio set picks up a signal and transmits it, or it permits consciousness. And it's this third one that I believe to be right, and I'm not alone in this. I think William James saw this. I think Aldous Huxley saw this. I think a lot of people are beginning to see that this is a possible way of understanding the brain, that it actually, in a way, funnels and restricts and filters consciousness such that my consciousness as me, your consciousness as you, can come about. Because I believe that consciousness is a broad field, and our consciousness is part of that field, which for a while needs to be constrained so that it becomes our consciousness during our lifetime. If this is the case, in any case, that the brain has something to do with the structure of mind, and I think you'd be pretty much of an outlier that thought that there was no relationship, then it's going to be relevant, and it's going to be relevant, as I say, to all aspects of life. Now, what is the distinction? In the past, it was too often thought to be about what this machine, the brain, does. We think about everything in science until very recently as mechanical. About 100 years ago, or more actually, physicists began to see that this was a completely untenable view of the inanimate world, but perversely, those dealing with the animate world have gone on seeing organisms as mechanisms. I'm very glad to report that the light is beginning to dawn, and there's really a rather interesting and important time in biology, as we now begin to see that organisms are nothing like mechanisms, and that they have fascinating properties that cannot be explained by a complicated machine, however complicated. They can only be explained by complex systems. The distinction is this: a Harrier jet engine is a complicated machine, but a small organism, a single cell amoeba is a complex system. And the differences are they have re-entrant loops that can't be mapped. They are never fully determined or determinable, not entirely predictable. But that doesn't mean there's chaos. There is a sweet spot in everything between order and disorder. And it is that at which all existence seems to settle, and particularly life. So what is it then if it's not the difference in what the two halves of the brain do? You know, it used to be said, the left does reason and language, and the right hemisphere paints pictures and is given to fits of creativity. But this is not right at all. First of all, the left hemisphere is not unemotional, it is not particularly rational, it is much less reliable than the right hemisphere. In fact, the emotion that most strongly lateralizes is anger, and guess what? It lateralizes to the left hemisphere, and it's frankly delusional unless it has the right hemisphere to guide it. That's why the word delusions comes into the subtitle of The Matter with Things. Because I believe we now live in a world that is frankly delusional. I think that anybody wise living in the past or anybody wise living in the future, if we leave a world for people to live in the future, will look back on this as the simply most insane moment, the least wise in the history of humanity, but unfortunately, it's also the one with the greatest power and influence over the world, over its own fortunes, which may or may not be a good thing, but certainly over the whole of the living earth. We heard about this from Matt, and I, of course, believe that he's right. So the difference is something different. The difference is the role of attention. And that might sound not particularly riveting. In fact, when I first realized that the important difference was the difference of attention, it didn't entirely occur to me how utterly foundational this is. But in fact, how we attend changes what it is that we see there. And it changes us, because if we attend in a certain way, there may be scenes from films that you felt very uncomfortable because you were invited to view in a detached way, a scene that called for you to be compassionate and involved. And this sets up a dissonance in us. It changes us to be callous towards things that call to us and speak to us. But it also changes them, because the world around us, in which not just nature is being despoiled, but social life, the cohesion of a society, what the Greeks call the polis, is being fragmented and beginning to fall apart. So how you see things is very important. And one hemisphere, for perfectly understandable and important evolutionary reasons, needs to pay attention just to a detail, because it's intent on picking up something that is important to eat or important to use for some purpose. So its value is just that of what does this mean to me? What is its utility? And of course, nothing could be, well, something can be more important, but you don't get to first base if you don't eat. So that is pretty important. But while it's paying this very narrow beam attention, something else has to be paying attention to the whole, looking out for predators while you're looking for prey, looking out for your kin, looking out for your conspecifics, looking out for your mate, looking out for your offspring, trying to understand the whole of what you're taking in this world. And that is the task of the right hemisphere. And in a soundbite, I say the left hemisphere helps us apprehend the world, which means literally to grasp onto it, and the right hemisphere to comprehend it, which means to grasp it together as a whole. So what are these two worlds like if you pay different attention to them? You can probably work this out for yourself. But the left hemisphere tends to want to close down on a certainty, because it's that thing that it knows it needs and wants. And it prefers things and tends to cast them as things that are already known and familiar, certain, fixed, so they can be easily grabbed, explicit, abstracted from context, disembodied, general in nature, and reduced to its parts, because if you're looking at details, you don't see the whole, you see the bits. In fact, everything as a whole at a different level. The parts are in fact an invention of the left hemisphere's mode of attending. And of course, it's very much reinforced in us because we've made clever machines and we think of everything as something like the way we would have made it, which is mechanical. In the right hemisphere, instead of closing down to a certainty, it's opening up to a possibility. So it's seeing what is fresh, unique, never fully known, never finally certain, but full of potential. It understands that context changes everything, understands whatever is implicit, and that nothing is never merely static and unchanging, but flowing and radically interconnected. It understands that parts of the left hemisphere's invention, as I say, and that they're really wholes at another level. And two further interesting and important distinctions. One that is fascinating, but perhaps slightly less important, is that the left hemisphere sees things that we would normally consider living as inanimate. And the right hemisphere sees things that we might generally think of as inanimate, sometimes as living and alive. So the sun is a living body that moves across the heavens. You can, don't try this at home, as they used to say, but you can experimentally suppress one hemisphere at a time in a normal subject in a painless way, and you therefore don't have to wait for what are called accidents of nature, but you can actually experiment with isolating a hemisphere and find out what it's capable of and how it sees the world. But the second distinction won't necessarily set you on fire, but it's probably the single biggest distinction. It's between a world seen by the right hemisphere that is fully present, that is indeed more than just present in a passive way, but is coming into being for you. It is a becoming world. It is what Heidegger called presencing to you, unwesend. So this is the world that the right hemisphere sees, whereas the left hemisphere almost immediately, in the twinkling of an eye, and before you're even aware of it, has said, oh, it's one of those, I've got it, I've got a diagram of that, I've got a map, and therefore it represents the world. And of course, represent means present again, when actually it's no longer present. And so the left hemisphere's world is a non-existent world made up of two-dimensional representation. I mean that literally. So the left hemisphere on its own sees space two-dimensionally rather than three-dimensionally. It sees things exactly the way we would through our machines. It sees them as inert, as I say, two-dimensional, as something like a schema, a theory, or a diagram. And the right hemisphere is the one that goes, yeah, that may be your theory and diagram. It's self-consistent, but it doesn't actually square up to the reality. Look out of the window and see what the world is like. One of the problems with modernity is we build around us a world that mimics the left hemisphere's world, full of hard rectilinear surfaces, devoid of the living, and in which we are fragmented and separated in little boxes. And this therefore looks like, well, that's the way the world is, not just in my theory, but in reality. Because we've lost social cohesion, we've lost a sense of oneness with the natural world, and we've lost a sense of the divine or the sacred. And these three things are the single most important things for human flourishing and human happiness. That's not just my opinion. There's a massive research about this, and I give some of it, particularly about social disintegration, at the end of The Master and His Hemisphere, and I give more about oneness with nature and oneness with the spiritual realm, which is the most overwhelming determinant of human happiness and health, mental health and physical health that we know of. And the evidence is very strong. So if you doubt me, and I doubted it to begin with, I thought I better just look and see whether the spiritual health has any, spiritual insight has any effect on happiness and on physical health. And it's absolutely overwhelming and it's undeniable. So that's where we live now. Now, there are some philosophical consequences of this vision. First of all, it helps us to see different aggregations from the ones that we normally see. So we have various ready-made dichotomies, reason versus feeling, for example, rationality versus intuition, System 1 versus System 2, according to Daniel Kahneman, the male brain versus the female brain. All of these we're familiar with, but none of them really works, and none of them is like what we find by the difference between these two hemispheres. It organizes different qualities into two coherent groups, the constituents of which are not so obvious that we see immediately their relatedness, but nonetheless, once adverted to, make intuitive sense. For example, if you ask most people, stop them in the street and try this. Do you think realism, the appreciation of uniqueness, music and time, a sense of humor, a capacity for reading body language, sustaining attention and the flight or flight mode, do you think they've got anything in common? Again, it might be an unwise experiment to try unless you've got a bodyguard. But you could also ask, is unreasonable optimism, complacency, manipulation, disembodiment, literalism, and preoccupations with detail, theory, and body parts, do they make a cohesive collection of thoughts or principles? And the answer is they do, and quite why they do and how they do, I hope, can be seen through my working out of these in my written work. So that's one thing. Secondly, it enables us to associate certain kinds of take on the nature of things with primarily one or the other hemisphere. So we can look at a certain way of thinking and say, that looks like the left hemisphere at work. And we can look at another and say, that looks more like the right hemisphere's way of seeing, understanding, and bringing into being for us the world. Why is that important? Because thirdly, it enables us to evaluate probabilities of veridicality, of being close to the truth for each of two competing points of view in philosophy. I don't mean in general in philosophy, but in any one situation. So for example, a lot of the history of philosophy is, well, these people thought this, but these other philosophers thought that. And the end of this is basically a shrug of the shoulders where you follow whichever you want. But I dare to say that by illuminating in detail what it is the hemispheres do and how much purchase each one has on reality, it can help us make a decision which one is more likely to be close to the truth. So this is why I spent 400 pages in the opening of the Matter with Things, looking at the ports of entry of information and knowledge about the world before we even start thinking about that knowledge. And I take those to be attention, perception, which is not the same as attention, judgment, i.e. the thoughts that we build on what we've attended to and perceived, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, in other words, IQ, and creativity, our ability to understand things flexibly. These are the ways in which we get information and see what it is that's going on before we get to first base. And all of these, as I demonstrate, are better served by the right hemisphere. And it's not just I, but several other neurologists who have said verbatim, the left hemisphere on its own is delusional. And interestingly, there are a lot of conditions in neuropsychiatry, which are in themselves extraordinary and perhaps fascinating. And the really delusional ones, pretty much all of them, and I mean, really, I can only think of one that is, and it's a very limited one, and not a very extreme one, which is common after damage to the left hemisphere. All the others are due to impairments in the right hemisphere. It is a massive effect. It adds to an understanding of paradox. So you probably know the story of Achilles and the tortoise. This is one of the paradoxes of the early Greek philosopher Zeno. And this goes something like this. Achilles was famously swift of foot. And the tortoise says, I can beat you in a race. Achilles, being a generous kind of guy, goes, I don't think so, but if you insist. And he gives the tortoise a very fine start. And Zeno says, and Achilles can never not only overtake the tortoise, but never even catch up with the tortoise. Why is that? Because first, Achilles has got to get to the place where the tortoise started from. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved on. So now he's got to get to the place where the tortoise now is. But by then the tortoise has moved on. You see where this is going. And this is an infinite number of steps, and an infinite number of steps. It's not true, but according to Zeno, an infinite number of steps need an infinite amount of time. So what you notice here is 4 typical things about the left hemisphere. First of all, fragmentation. So you're breaking the thing up into steps that are not actually what happens. In real life, Achilles, if you ask him, I overtake the tortoise in 2 strides, and lo and behold, he does. The second thing is it converts everything into little fixed static moments. There's a piece here, another piece there, and another piece there. But motion is a flow. And the most important discovery of Bergson, Henri Bergson, a philosopher who is, I think, enjoying a renaissance that is very much deserved and long overdue. His big insight was that time is not a series of instants, but is instead something like a melody that flows, is indivisible. On the page, it looks like it's made up of notes, but in actuality, it is a seamless flow, and it takes in the past and it gestures towards the future. The third thing is that what we're seeing here is a representation of an action, which is 2 creatures moving. Instead, we've got a representation which we can then graph and cut up in certain ways. And the fourth is this is all taking place in an abstract realm. It has all the hallmarks of the left hemisphere about it. Whereas by contrast, our intuitive understanding takes us what's happening as individual wholes, the nature of motion as it is, present within embodied experience, and has all the hallmarks of the right hemisphere about it. I only mention that because I consider about 30 paradoxes that have classically puzzled philosophers. And I don't reckon that I've sort of explained them all, as it were, and that's the end of it. But I have, I hope, cast some light on the way these arise, because they are to do with the conflict between the 2 hemispheres' ways of seeing things. Again, fifthly, it enables us to see more clearly what claims can be made for and what limitations need to be respected in each of our main epistemological paths, which I take to be science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And sixthly, in putting together an understanding of the strengths and limitations of the hemispheres in comprehension, as opposed to apprehension of the world, it gives us, I believe, a firmer basis for developing an ontology. In other words, what is it that exists, which was the reason I embarked on this project. What can we say? Obviously not that there is a truth we've arrived at. That would be a left hemisphere fantasy. There's a truth out there. We take enough steps and we arrive at it, and we've got it. Truth is not of that nature. But it does not mean that just truth is up for grabs and anything I decide is true is true. No, there is real truth. But don't confuse that with the idea that it's got to be fixed and somehow externally out there. The fact that I play some part in coming to that truth doesn't vitiate the truth. It's the condition of the being truth, because truth means a relationship. Plight my troth was an old-fashioned way of referring to what was then the most sacred relationship of marriage. You plight your troth, and truth come from the word true. I'm true to somebody. And that idea has a great deal of wisdom in it. So some of those ideas that I would like to suggest give us a lead on how to develop an ontology. It gives us a way of understanding the coincidence of opposites, as well as the necessary interdependence of the one and the many. And it would take me too long and a big diversion to explain that in any detail now. But the left hemisphere cannot understand that a thing and its apparent contrary could both be true. But in fact, we know a lot of the time that this is the case. And one of the reasons that public discourse, one of the many reasons that public discourse is now so unsatisfactory, is that there is no room for people saying, yes, there is a great deal of truth in this, but there's also a great deal of truth in the precisely opposite position. And if there were more people who could see that, we'd have a happier world. also if we revived some good manners and stopped shouting at one another and decided that it was a good idea to listen to one another, that would be a step forward. In fact, I believe nobody should finish their education without having undergone couple therapy, whether you need couple therapy or not. Couple therapy is a wonderful tool. It goes something like this. One of the parties is speaking and is talking about how he or she sees the relationship. This is very important. The other person wants to chip in, and the therapist says, no, let them speak because you'll have your turn in a minute. And then the person stops speaking. And the first thing that is asked of the other person is, what did you just hear said? And this is revelatory because it's very often completely different from what the person actually intended. And to be able to understand that, you have to try to see the other person's point of view and say what it is. And you're not allowed to speak your own version until you've, to the other person's satisfaction, said, yes, that's what I meant. And then you, instead of endlessly, floundering in a sea of falsehoods, you actually have some planks of truth, at least to begin to understand one another. At the end of it, you may say, well, I at least understand you, but I don't think I want to be your partner. But at least that would be a very fine step forward. And so we ought to teach that in school. Again, it supports a view that primacy should be given to relations over relata, over the things that are related, and the importance of what I call betweenness, which is not just empathy, although that's very important, and it's not just a space between things, it is what happens when two entities enter into a relationship. And the simplest way of putting this is something like an electrical circuit. Is the electricity in the positive pole? No. Is it in the negative pole? No. Is it just in the space between them? No. It's in the two poles and the space between them together. That's where the electricity is. And that's a model for understanding a great deal of reality, if not all of reality, that I believe that relations, people say, how can we have relationships if we haven't already got the things that are going to be related? But I'd ask you, you can't have the thing that is related until you know what relationships it's in, because it's those relationships that make it what it is. We're all made what we are by the network of relationships, the context in which we grow, in which we talk, in which we act. And if you don't know that, you don't know what the thing is at all. Thirdly, it problematizes, as we say now, an ontology of things and supports an ontology of process. The right hemisphere sees things as constantly moving, connected, and flowing, whereas the left hemisphere sees them as fixed, separate, and static. Again, it suggests that explicit knowledge is better seen as a special case of the implicit, which is universal. So all knowledge is really universal. And under very special circumstances, we extract explicit knowledge from the situation for a utilitarian purpose. But actually, implicit knowledge is the overarching thing that we are dealing with. And we shouldn't mistake this cheap Woolworths version of knowledge for what really knowledge and understanding is. It suggests the primacy of continuity over discreteness, by which I mean separateness, and of interdependence over independence. Again, in so doing, it changes our understanding of both space and time, but perhaps particularly time. Extension is a new element in the world. Even a straight line is a remarkable thing. What is a line? Made up of points? No, it isn't. Because a point has no extension. It doesn't have a tiny bit of extension. It has no extension. So you can have an infinity of points. You never actually reach a straight line. So just to get from a point to a straight line involves a new element in your philosophy, in your ontology. Now, if you start thinking about this in terms of the duration and the existence of beings in time and space, you come to a quite different picture. And it's closest probably to a viewpoint that I find best expressed in the ancient world. All the things I've mentioned are best expressed in the philosophy of Heraclitus, who I believe was the greatest philosopher of all time. And I'm sorry about the footnotes to Plato, but I believe that it's the volumes that expound Heraclitus that really get that. And of course, it's also followed up very much by Whitehead and by Bergson and by William James and by an earlier romantic German philosopher Schelling, who again repays greater attention than he often gets. And in turn, all of this has implications for our view of consciousness and matter as not separate entities, but as phenomenologically distinct aspects of a single foundational cosmic process, I would claim. And moreover, it suggests the importance of some form of process theology. And there are, of course, more than one form that it may take, though without this necessarily imperiling the wholeness and perfection of the divine. Finally, hemispheric differences suggest that not ever greater specialization alone, but being able to see the broad picture will enormously aid understanding of what we are doing, even within our special areas of concern. One way of looking at the matter with things is that by starting from a consideration of neuropsychology, philosophy, and physics, which one might imagine as three equidistant points on the surface of a sphere, as one burrows deeper, one finds one's vision converging on the same gestalt at the core. By a gestalt, I mean the same whole vision that cannot be simply degraded into its parts without loss. And furthermore, as if to confirm its centrality, that vision is consonant with important ancient wisdom traditions from different parts of the globe. One expression of that necessarily broader view is this conference, which takes a radically transdisciplinary approach with physicists, philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, educators, a theologian, a biologist, and a novelist amongst us. This is truly wonderful, and thank you all for being here to take part. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We're off to a great start. So we have about, what time is it? 34 minutes for dialogue. We're going to finish at 9 and we have to be out of the building by 9:30. So some time for conversation afterwards, but we do need to exit. So there are people online who have questions. There are people in the room who have questions. Andrew's going to pass the mic on that side of the room, and on this side of the room, I will pass the mic. Questions, comments, please. Start over here. And feel free to share your name.
Hi, my name's Amelia. Thank you so much for that beautiful talk. I was wondering if you've done any research on handedness, so lateralities. I've done a little bit of research with some studies from Germany specifically, and they talk about when children at a young age are switched handedness, it overrides. I can't remember if it's the opposite hemisphere or if it's the same hemisphere, but if you have, I'd love to hear about it.
Yes, I quite deliberately have left that to one side because it's a quite different area. I wanted to talk about the normal way in which, as it were, the brain works for a right-hander. And it's not that I'm not interested in left-handers, they're some of the most gifted people, but it's just that there is a very good book on this by Chris McManus called Right Hand, Left Hand. And I can't improve on it, and I didn't want to replicate it. So I refer people to that book because the issue of handedness is distinct. Effectively, I deal with it on pages 9 to 11 or something in The Master and His Hemisphere, so very early on. So what I say is, effectively, there are logically three possible things that can happen in the left-hander. One is they have exactly the same setup that a right-hander has. That does happen. They can have the exact flip image of it. So everywhere where I say right, you'd have to say left. That also happens. But far the commonest is that there is an unusual amalgam of things which don't quite map onto the usual picture at all. And because they're so various and almost vary with every single person, it's a very hard thing to discuss. It's much easier to deal with the standard issue right-hander. But what you find is that it both leads to certain vulnerabilities and to certain gifts. So you tend to find left-handers at the bottom and the top of most spectra. Or perhaps in this egalitarian world, I should say on the left and on the right, but I thought that might be confusing.
I'll sit down so everyone can see you still. I'm a clinical medical anthropologist and a professor here at CIS, and we thank you for letting us anoint you a transdisciplinarianist. Now, I'd like to pose a problem I have with a patient right now. He had 6 sessions with a therapist and coach, and then the company that he was receiving these from transferred him to a digital bot. And his 5th session, he said, was dehumanizing and triggered an eating disorder, and he feels lost and disappeared. So at this point, I'm trying to present an argument to the company to say, I know you are so convinced with your AI's ability to learn infinitely and to actually respond in human-like language, but there was something so radically missing that this man went into a downspin that we're trying to recover now. And it's sort of, I'm trying to find the words to express what investments, billions into investments of actually replacing therapists and coaches with digital CBT.
Well, this is
what quality of humanity can I express to them?
Why does this story not surprise me? It's again a massive misunderstanding of what a human being is. We are above all relational beings, and there is no possible relation with a machine that parrots something it's been programmed to parrot. It's demeaning, it's depressing. It would induce in me a feeling of despair if I was sent to a therapist that was a machine and that was saying sort of, oh, I feel your pain. I don't, this is not what I want. I want actually to speak to another fellow human being who understands these things, who has him or herself suffered, knows a great deal about and has experience of human beings, knows that we're going to die, knows all the things that we know. And there just is no comparison. You know, we have so many facets that can never be programmed into a machine, including, of course, the whole realm of the spiritual, if you happen to think that's very important, which I do. So I would say this is absolutely classic left hemisphere misunderstanding of, and it's all in the service of saving money, of utility, in other words. And I know that you can find papers that will suggest that a certain intervention by a bot worked for certain people, but I'm convinced that overall this is not the case. And I know enough experiences like the one that you described to make me think that my intuition that human beings want human beings to be pretty an important one. Thank you.
We've got some online questions, Dr. McGilchrist, if I
Sure.
could read one for you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read it as it appears on the screen, and I
Yep.
apologize to any online attendees that if I mispronounce your name, but this comes from Seraphine Winslow, and she asks, could Dr. McGilchrist touch on connections between his view of the functions of the left and right hemisphere and Professor John Vervaeke's analysis of propositional, which I assume is left hemispheric, versus non-propositional, procedural, perspectival, participatory kinds of knowing?
Yes. Well, there is a great deal of overlap, and I'm very proud that John Vervaeke is here this evening and will be with us for this conference. And it might be better to ask him, but since you asked me, I think that he's making several distinctions, some of which lie in the same direction as right and left, but some of which lie in the direction of upper and lower. So the brain has functionally three axes, front to back, top to bottom, and right to left. And each of these exists in a dynamic relationship with its other. And I think that some of them, like procedural knowledge, are to do with a kind of knowing that is in the body. It is an embodied knowledge, which, if it has representation in the brain at all, is probably in the cerebellum, but is quite as much disseminated throughout the central nervous system, and is therefore not really subject to the left-right take on things. Propositional knowledge, I think, is very much a case of the left hemisphere work. Explicit statements that are considered either true or not, at least in the simplest understanding of them. One can have more sophisticated ways of thinking of them. Perspectival knowledge seems to me to be to do with experience and the particular context and experience of the person. I hope I'm not travestying what John has to say here, but that would seem to me to be more cognate with the right hemisphere's view. And I'm now forgetting the fourth element in the story, which is the right?
Participatory.
Yeah, well, participatory knowledge is, I think all knowledge to me has to be participatory, because we only know things by being enmeshed in the world at all. And so I'm sorry again if I'm misconstruing, but I would see both hemispheres as deeply involved in that, but the ways in which they take their participatory knowledge is different. So, as I say, the right hemisphere is better at experiential knowledge, better at experiential understanding, better at understanding the cues that come to us from the environment. So perhaps in that sense, participatory knowledge is again more of a right hemisphere phenomenon. But of course, the left hemisphere can only get its knowledge from participation, even if the participation is mediated to it from the right hemisphere.
Good question in the back.
Thank you, Dr. Iain. I had the fortune of being taught Master and Emissary by Alan Shore, your friend. And like some of the people here, I'm a somatics person, and I'm also a philosopher of science. So I'm interested in puzzling out, like Heraclitus's nice statement, you can't step into the same river twice. Is that a left hemisphere statement or a right hand one? And my interest is in pushing process philosophy alongside Bergson, but beyond Whitehead. And so my interest is in this, that we don't really get to step out of the right hemisphere, especially with somatics people. You don't get to leave the body. And so you always find yourself returning to being in the river. And none of the process ontologies so far really deals with deocularizing being in the river. So I just want to explore that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, my way of understanding this famous saying of Heraclitus is that everything is in flow, and that is the basis of a process ontology. And that therefore, when you think you are stepping into the same element, it is already something else, because it is both itself and not itself. It is both not, from a left hemisphere point of view, exactly the same river as before, but from a right hemisphere point of view, it is the same river. This is like the so-called growing paradox of the Greeks. You know, your body is turning over, the cells are replacing themselves. So is it still really you? This is a version of the ship of Theseus paradox, you know. And these paradoxes seem to me to, like most paradoxes, to illuminate a difference between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere's take on things. And I think Heraclitus's purpose was to make that point in a dramatic way. And as you know, his pupil, Polybius, I can't remember. Sorry? Cratylus. Yeah, Cratylus, thank you. Exactly, Cratylus said, you can't step into the same river once, which really makes the same point more dramatically. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. My question is, where somebody said you were hopeful. And so where is the hope found besides here? Where else in your life or in the world can we look for that hope?
Well, there's a saying, you ought to get out more, which could apply to me. could apply to me. I spend a lot of time at home. Well, increasingly little these days, but I do like to be there. And the world as mediated to me from afar is disturbing, and it's hardly a matter for congratulation or the sense that we're really making good progress. It's a worrying world. But for example, just while I've been here, the pupils, the students that I have met at the 2 universities I was at before I came here, my experience was wonderful. It really has made me more optimistic that there are such lovely, devoted, scholarly-minded young people who really want to learn and to understand, and who are responsive and engaged and engaging and have a lovely sense of humor. And actually for me, the sense of humor, which is why I did that slightly unplanned thing at the beginning of the, I do apologize to anyone I may have offended. But humor to me is one of the greatest things we have. I say to John Cleese, it's up there, you are up there with the great poets. As far as I'm concerned, humor is like poetry. It's saying all kinds of, making connections and cheering us and moving us. And we must not lose humor. We must not get so terribly dour and rule-bound that we stop having that. So I feel, having seen what I've seen, much happier about the world than I was when I know I've seen a rather select version of the world, as I see amongst you here. But if we could just get a small percentage, perhaps only 3% or 5% of the population, really to see what I'm getting at about the difference between this fragmented, pointless cosmos of random movements of pieces that have no meaning, no direction, and no beauty, no goodness, no truth. If we could get away from that in only a small fraction of the population, I think a lot of things would change. So for example, just to say very briefly, I knew that I would get a lot of messages from philosophers, psychiatrists, psychologists, and perhaps it doesn't surprise me, I've also got them from lawyers a lot, but also from politicians and from economists, which I don't know the first thing about economics. Apparently can't even pronounce it, but anyway, it's an aversion I have to the subject. But what I'm really saying is that people from all walks of life are waking up and asking me things. So there was an investigation into the way COVID was handled in Britain, inevitably. And the people who were on that tribunal, some of them contacted me because they wanted to apply some of my ideas to the way in which things unraveled. And I thought it was perfectly right that they should. So I think people are seeing it. They know in their bones, even if they don't know there's anything to do with this man McGilchrist, whoever the hell he is. But the point is they know, and people write to me and say, what you say, I know in my bones. I've always known it, but I never had the language. The way I was educated, we were not taught to express these things. And you have given me language and confidence to say them. So that's where I get my sense of hope from.
John Ravicki.
Correct me.
No, Ian, you did a great job. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks for the wonderful talk. I continue to be impressed, as I have in our previous conversations, of the really pretty amazing convergence between your work and my own. So a question that's been pressing on me, and maybe it's pressing on you because it's implicit in a lot of what you were saying, and I know I don't want to make everything explicit, but if you give up notions of certainty and coherence between propositions and correctness between propositions in the world, these are a lot of the ways in which we've talked about truth. And I agree with you, you're rejecting that. And I want to hear a little bit more about what the positive alternative is. I agree with the rejection. What do we now say about truth that isn't just a platitude?
Okay, good question. But I'd like to say that I don't take that position that you put into my mouth.
Oh, sorry. Well, it's my position, so.
I mean, I think I do. I know why we could agree on it, but I just it's not that there's no 100% certainty, but there are still certain things that are truer than others, and these are anchors, and these are part of reality. And you know, the way in which we've made progress through reason and science is not by dogma; it is by the rejection of dogma. And good reasoning and good science do not hold with dogma. And it's against dogma that I'm talking. So of course there are truths. I'm a passionate defender of truth. I hope I made that clear during my talk. And I do think that there are things that are more certain than others, more true than others. So I don't want to fall into either of these apparent opposites of it's all knowable in principle, it's just facts and we must get there. And the other position that it's just whatever we care to make up. These are both toxic positions in my view, and neither of them will lead us to the truth. So what is the alternative, you ask? And it is to do with fidelity to ideas and experience that speak to you as true. And then you have to find reasons for explaining to others why you think that they are true. But it is that sense of true in a relationship that is better than the idea of truth as a thing, even if it's an abstract thing, here or out, either in here or out there. It is a relation. It is always a relation. It's that point I want to emphasize above all. Is that agreeable to you, John?
Yeah, I wasn't saying there isn't a truth. I was trying to get at what you would propose to the standard ways we got at truth given to us by modernity. I hear you saying, and like you, I'm a scientist, I agree, and I pursue science, but I'm also interested in the idea that we need a notion of truth that is about contact with reality rather than representing reality. And that I heard you saying that throughout.
That is it, exactly, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question over here. And then I know the mic's over there, you're next.
There's this irony that one can be extremely interested in your work and still be dominated by the left hemisphere. The most compelling thing that you have said is that how one attends changes what one sees. That part that wishes to manipulate locks on that word changes. And the real key there is the word attend and an implied notion of relationship. I'd really appreciate it if you could expand on that to kind of move away from that wish to manipulate.
Yeah. Well, there are two things there. I mean, I think the first is the way in which attention changes the world. And I'm not sure that that was what you were asking me to expand on, or was it?
How one attends.
But it was more about how one can change the way one attends. Is that it?
Well, to manage the wish to take that sentence and manipulate the outcome.
Yes. Well, I think the first thing is to see what's happening. What I aim to do when writing is to bring before the reader quite what it is that has been lost from our world, because we don't see what it is we don't see, very obviously. And things can disappear and we no longer miss them. We no longer know they've gone. And so our world becomes increasingly simplified, constricted, and prone to preconceptions. And so what I'm trying to suggest to people is see what it is that's lost, see how important it is. And I don't need to tell you, if you really see what it is we're talking about, what to do, in a way. Because if people don't see what I'm saying, I can't help them to know what to do. But if they do see it, they will know instinctively what to do. This is important knowledge I gained from being a psychiatrist. So knowledge in the sense of understanding propositions and what the patient should do often came to me very early in my relationship with the patient. And when I was inexperienced, I used to tell them. But that was a mistake, because they needed to see it for themselves. In a way, they needed to discover it for themselves, not unaided, like left to flounder. My job was to bring them to the place where they could see it for themselves and go, I know what I'm doing. I know what I need to do. And when they do that, then I don't need to tell them anymore what to do, actually, because they already see it. So the left hemisphere wants me to have a list of things that we can do, and I can come up with it. You know, I can do things like we need to reform the educational system so that STEM subjects don't drive out everything else. I don't say they're not important, but they're not really the basis of an education. They teach techniques and they teach facts. But really what you need is the humanities, because without them, you don't understand. I mean, the clue is in the name. You know, if you want to understand humanity, how about trying the humanities? You know, and so since we're driving that out of our world, and one of the most obvious things about it is nobody has the foggiest idea what a human being really is anymore, then we probably ought to do something about the educational system. And I can talk endlessly about things we can spend our time doing, reconnecting with nature, reading works of art, listening to music, and perhaps trying to find some regular way in which we can connect with a realm above us, beyond us. I mean, just knowing that there is something beyond what we know would be a good start. It seems to me so resoundingly obvious that we can't know everything. We can't know anything much, really. I mean, if a mouse was able to speak, it would say, well, I know everything. But it doesn't know what we know. Mind you, we don't know what it knows. So, you know, we really do need to rediscover a degree of humility and compassion for those who don't agree with us. And then the world will become wonderful again and inspire awe rather than this clever thing. We can manipulate it better. You know, we have the power to do so many things, but we haven't got the wisdom to know how to use it.
Trevor Griffiths, also enjoying a break from England, so pleased to meet you.
Yeah.
Greatly enjoying the answers you're giving, so thank you. My question is about consciousness. I think it's David Chalmers who split consciousness awareness into the hard problem and the soft problems and so on. And the hard problem, of course, is how on earth can you relate thoughts to brain activity and somehow, I'm not sure how you would phrase that. But in the light of what you've been saying about the fragmentation that comes from left hemisphere thinking, could it be that the whole, the hard problem is itself a delusion from left brain thinking?
Well, thank you. You've probably given me my answer, but to be fair, it must be wonderful to become world famous for saying this is difficult. But my answer is it's as difficult as you set the problem up to be. If you set the problem up to be, how does this, you know, lump of jelly on the pathologist's slab give rise to consciousness? You've got a hard problem. But it never crossed my mind that that would be the right way to approach this. Through decade after decade, even centuries of people speculating, nobody still has the slightest convincing idea of how it may do it. There's a kind of, well, and then a miracle happens, complexity. We have complexity. And that's a good idea, because we could make complex, wires and hope that something marvelous happens. Suddenly they became conscious. I'm not sure about that. And one of my reasons for not being sure about it is that, forgive me, but you probably all know this, but the brain that we call the brain, the cerebrum, contains only 20% of the neurons inside your skull. The rest are in the cerebellum. Now that's extraordinary. 80% of your neurons are in the cerebellum, and the cerebellum doesn't sustain consciousness. Why not? It's got exponentially more possible connections to make than the cerebrum. And you may say, well, maybe they're all very simple neurons, they don't make connections. That is not true. In fact, probably the most massively ramified neurons, Purkinje neurons, are particular to the cerebellum. So the idea that sort of suddenly complexity happens and then, whoo, there's a phenomenological world. I don't get that either. I really don't. So, yeah, basically, I agree, Trevor, with your question and your answer. Thank you very much for it.
Good evening, doctor. I'm over here. My name is Violeta Krasnic. Welcome to CIS. I'm a staff member here. I'm a student here. I think my question is in the similar vein, except that I want to bring it down maybe to a level of a case study. My dear friend Asbia is in North Macedonia and she's in a coma. She had a brain aneurysm hemorrhage and a vasospasm, and she is in a persistent, not permanent, vegetative state. Could you help me? Where is her consciousness? Where is her awareness? Where is her cognition? Where is her emotional self? And to expand it a bit more, where does the matter become conscious and consciousness becomes materialized? And if it's a process, is there a point or understanding of where is it on and where is it off? I also have a question about neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, but I'll
sure.
put it, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just tell me where her consciousness is, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'll settle for the little one. Of course, you don't expect me to be able to answer that question. If you mean in space, I have no idea. What we do know is that people who have been in persistent vegetative states do report conscious experiences afterwards, which can be verified. So some level of consciousness is maintained. And we don't understand what the relationship between consciousness and matter is. There are these extraordinary cases, not just of people with advanced, or not advanced, but marked hydrocephalus, who have very little brain inside their skull, but are nonetheless perfectly normally functioning. And this might only be discovered at post-mortem. John Lorber described a case of a man who got a first-class degree in mathematics from Leeds University and was also socially and emotionally normal, but he only had a tiny rim of cortex inside his skull. And there are also, even more dramatically, individuals called hydranencephalic. That's not to say those with hydrocephalus, nor anencephaly, which is normally incompatible with life, but hydranencephalus, they have a head, but there is no brain in it. And these people are able to do remarkable things. They can enjoy music, they can see different people, they can recognize faces, they have friends, they have favorite toys. Now, these are people who have nothing in the way of what we normally think of as a brain, and it's not coming from their cerebellum. So quite what is going on here, I don't know. But I come back to my idea that the brain is a filter, if you like, of consciousness. and that in different conditions, it can filter more or less. And it probably adapts to the conditions it's in. One of the mysteries is when a bit of the brain is damaged that has always subserved a certain function, how is it that other areas of the brain chip in and take over this function? Because in the machine, the thing would just disappear and that would be it. But the organism knows that it needs something which is a part of consciousness, perhaps being able to listen to music, and a bit of cortex takes over and does this. This is it's not commented on enough how remarkable this fact is. How does this work? And it comes round to this idea that there is a wholeness which is not summed up in any of the parts. And I've mentioned already today, and no doubt will again and again, because he's also going to be speaking with us tomorrow, Mike Levin's work, which seems to me fascinating, and in which he is suggesting that organisms have capacities that he is frankly saying he can't now explain where they are or what they are, but they have memories, they have shapes, they have forms, and these can be transmitted from one creature to another, and they can also be inherited by, you can cut the head off a flatworm and it will regrow, may regrow many times, but it has the memories that the previous one had. Where, why, I don't know. But I just leave you with one thought. Max Scheler, who's an early 20th century German phenomenological philosopher that I greatly admire, said that our thoughts and our feelings are not necessarily in our heads or anywhere. They may be in the space between us and the people, the creatures, the fellow creatures with whom we communicate. I don't know the answer to that. Thank you.
We're going to do two more questions. We have one from online and then one over here, and then we're going to have to wrap up. As much fun as we're having.
Okay, so Carol English asks or states, you have spoken of attention as a moral act. This is something I want to know and understand more about how you see this. It seems very important.
Yes, thank you. Well, if you see a human being as, say, to take a very simple argument, as something like a robot, not essentially different from a machine, then your way of envisioning what you're seeing in front of you or in the presence of is going to be different from one in which you see that person as a living entity that has feelings, that has awareness of life and death and suffering and all these things. And so you turn something into something else by attending to it in a different way. And in the case of the left hemisphere's attention, which is always designed towards what use is this to me? How can I map this? How can I model it? How can I use it and manipulate it? Then a lot is being lost, particularly if you're dealing with something that is living. But it can also be in almost any direction. So, for example, I say there is a big mountain behind my house, and its name in Norse means sloping rock, and we know that that means that the Vikings who came down here 1,000 years ago, not here, but where I live, saw this as a landmark, which was very important. It actually meant life and death to them. So that's what it was to them, because it showed them that there was a treacherous bay coming up. The Picts who lived there saw it as the home of the gods. They'd been there for 1,000 years before the Vikings came. In the 18th century, people came to draw it because it's a magnificent mountain and it has a beautiful color and texture. Then in the 19th century, people started to be more interested in geology. It happens to be a remarkable example of columnar basalt formation, so they came and studied that. Therefore, to a prospector, it is dollars. To a physicist, it's 99.99% nothing. And the other 0.01%, we don't know what it is. Now, which of these is the real mountain? None of them is exclusively the real mountain. Every one of them has a claim to be a real mountain. But depending on how you look at it, you alter yourself and you alter what is there. And when I look at what is happening around me, it has very, very obvious external impacts. So the reason we're trashing the environment is because the wrong attention was paid to it, which led us to believe it was just lumps of stuff for our use. It wasn't actually a prism through which we can see another world. So that's what I mean by being a moral act. Everything depends on your attention. And I'd just like to say that Simone Weil already said that attention is the gift whereby you give people what they need. It is in itself an act of love. And another French philosopher, Louis Level, said something similar slightly earlier, but there you go. Yeah.
It's kind of along the lines of the uncertainty of truth that Rebecca was speaking of. We know of like momentum and position as like conjugates, like when you go towards momentum, you have total uncertainty about conjugates. And it would seem like the product and process are similar. In your term, the hemisphere would be like similar. You have more uncertainty as you go from one side. So it seems like we can say, I don't know, and we're okay to contend with like uncertainty when it comes to knowledge, but we're really asking about like, how do we scale societies and how do we build culture? And that's kind of relying on like communication or action. So like, how do we deal with this uncertainty when it comes to communication or action?
Not sure I completely understand what's being asked of me, but how do we deal with it? Well, we must help people to see that nothing is certain. I mean, the first thing is nothing is certain except that you will die. So let's just, the rest of it is completely out of our hands. That's not to say we don't have an influence over it. So we must get used to the idea that things are uncertain. And this is a liberation. I mean, this is not something terrible. If they were all certain, it would mean that the whole thing was like a clockwork toy wound up by a deistic God who just tinkered with it from time to time. But that's not what we're living in. We're living in something that is creative and is creating itself. And I believe partaking in the creative evolution of the unfolding of the unpacking of what is implicit and potential in that divine source of being. So that's how I answer your question, very unsatisfactorily, I know, but there we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you so much, everyone. Lovely questions. We're done for tonight.